Hello and welcome to this month's webinar from the IEA Clean Coal Centre. My name's Stephen Mills and I'm a Senior Researcher and Author at the Centre. Our webinars are based on our technical reports which are available from our website at www.iea-coal.org. Residents, member countries and employees of sponsoring organisations can download our reports at no charge after one-off registration. Please visit our website for details. Today's webinar is on the prospects for coal and clean coal technologies in Turkey. The report is out in draft at the moment and will be published and available on our website within the next couple of months. If you have any questions to ask, please use the Ask a Question box at the top of your screen, and also add your email address as well so that I can send you a fuller answer if we've run out of time. Now, as I'm sure you're all aware, Turkey is surrounded on three sides by the Black Sea, the Aegean, and in the south by the Mediterranean. To the north is Bulgaria and Greece, and it's also flanked by Georgia, Armenia, Iraq, and to the south, Syria. The country is made up of 81 separate provinces and has a population of around 74 million. The major cities are Istanbul in the north and the capital, Ankara. Now, at the moment, Turkey is a very busy place. It's got one of the world's fastest growing economies. This is currently the 16th largest in the world and the 6th largest in Europe. By 2023, the country has an ambition to be amongst the top 10 global economies. Remarkably, it's managed to avoid much of the economic turmoil that's affected many countries around the world. In recent years, we've seen typical economic growth rates of between 8 and 10% a year. Now, this rapid economic expansion, coupled with a growing population and increasing industrialisation, has meant there's been a significant increase in energy demand. And during the last decade, the rate of increase of demand, particularly for natural gas and electricity, has only been surpassed by China. In the case of electricity, the increase has been as much as 8.5% a year. Much of this new demand has been met by new gas-fired power plants, although, as we'll hear a little later, as these rely almost entirely on imported supplies, this has, and continues to have, serious repercussions on the national trade balance. Still, having said that, overall, the country looks set to experience something of an energy boom, and over the next decade or so, the current level of energy demand is expected to double. Now, in order to meet this, the energy sector is going to need a lot of new investment, and if all goes according to plan, this will include an addition of at least 50 gigawatts of new generating capacity, and possibly quite a bit more. Now, like many countries, Turkey faces energy supply issues. Here, indigenous energy resources are limited almost exclusively to lignite and to a lesser extent hard coal. As a result, it relies heavily on imported sources of energy. More than 90% of its oil and 98% of its natural gas is imported, as indeed is much of the hard coal used. The cost of all this is considerable. In fact, it accounts for around a quarter of the country's entire annual import bill. And this graphic is just to give you some idea of the trend and the scale of things involved. The blue bars show the cost of it includes transport fuels, and the red ones exclude these. In 2012, total energy imports cost nearly $60 billion. By 2017, they're forecast to exceed $70 billion. So, the cost of energy imports to the country is significant and increasing. So it will come as no real surprise that the major government objective is to reduce this high dependency, particularly through making the greater use of indigenous lignite. As part of this, as we'll hear, the government has introduced various incentives to encourage its greater use. Now, like a lot of industrialised countries, Turkey relies mainly on a combination of fossil fuels plus renewables for its energy supply, and this is where most of the power currently comes from. Coal. The country produces energy from its own reserves of lignite and hard coal, and also imports quite a lot of hard coal. Oil. This is produced mainly in the southeast and northwest of the country, but since 1991, when production peaked, output has been falling as reserves have become increasingly depleted. At the moment, around 94% of the country's oil is being imported. Gas. Well, like oil, most of Turkey's gas is imported. In fact, it's usually between 98 and 99%. Since 1990, there's been a tenfold increase in consumption for power generation, and at the moment, around 45% of Turkey's electricity comes from gas-fired stations. Given that the country's electricity demand is expected to continue rising until at least 2020, and despite efforts to promote other forms of energy, gas demand is expected to continue increasing for some time. Nuclear. Well, the introduction of nuclear power forms an important component of Turkey's strategy to diversify its energy mix and reduce its heavy dependence on imported sources of energy. 2 projects are currently in development and a third is planned. And finally, renewables. Apart from hydropower, renewables are still largely underutilized in Turkey. Ironically, it's one of the windiest and sunniest places in Europe, and yet despite its large solar and wind energy potential, these have only been developed in small pockets. However, having said that, there is an ambitious target to generate 30% of the country's electricity from renewables by 2023. But whether this will be achievable within the timescale, we shall have to wait and see. And of course, as we've already mentioned, the country also has a lot of lignite and some hard coal that it intends to capitalise on, and we'll look at this shortly. So, as I mentioned, a lot of new investment is going to be needed to meet Turkey's growing energy demand, especially for natural gas and electricity. In the case of electricity, by the end of 2014, installed generating capacity is expected to have reached around 64 gigawatts. And although forecasts seem to disagree a bit, there's a goal to increase this to somewhere between 112 and 125 gigawatts by 2023, the centenary of the founding of the Republic. Similarly, estimates of the scale of investment needed vary, but the Turkish energy market regulator reckons that for the period 2010 to 2020, somewhere between $225 and $280 billion will need to be invested in the energy sector. Now, on the back of this, recent years have seen Turkey become an increasingly attractive destination for foreign investment in general. At the moment, much of this is coming from EU member states, followed by North America and Asia. So alongside Turkish companies and banks financing power projects, in the past few years there's been a growing number of overseas investors getting involved, and these are just a few examples. As you'll see, many of these have been for gas-fired projects, although more recently emphasis on coal has been increasing. In some cases, investment opportunities encompass both mining operations and power generation, and again, interest is coming from overseas investors. For instance, a number of major Chinese players are investing in lignite production and power generation projects within Turkey that will run into many billions of dollars. Now, current estimates suggest that Turkish coal resources exceed 13 gigatons. This is made up of nearly 12 of lignite and 1.3 of hard coal. However, particularly in the case of lignite, exploration is still taking place and additional reserves continue to be discovered. So far, many areas of the country have only been explored at shallow depths and others not at all. Consequently, it's anticipated that even more significant reserves will, quite literally be unearthed. Discoveries made within the past few years have added nearly 6 gigatons of lignite resources to the country's total. This has included 1.8 in the province of Konya, capable of powering 5 gigawatts of generating capacity for 30 or 40 years, and as recently as last July it was announced that a further 950 million tonnes had been discovered in the western province of Afyon, capable of supporting 3.5 gigawatts of power projects. And just to put this into some sort of context, this map shows the location of the main coal deposits. As you can see, the black area in the northwest is the location of virtually all of Turkey's hard coal. This is the Zonguldak Basin. It's not that far from Istanbul. The brown areas show the location of major confirmed lignite reserves. Although, as we've just heard, there's every possibility that new deposits will be located in the coming years. Now, depending where you are in the country, seam thickness can vary from a few metres right up to 40 metres. And on the extreme left, you'll also see the province of Soma, site of major lignite deposits and location of the recent tragic mine accident, which we'll come back to a little later. So just where does all of Turkey's lignite and hard coal actually go? Well, perhaps not surprisingly, most of the lignite produced goes directly to major power plants, usually sited in fairly close proximity to the mines. In some cases, it's fed directly by on-site conveyor systems. Much of the remainder is consumed by various industrial users, such as the iron and steel sector, cement producers and sugar factories. However, some is also used for domestic and commercial heating. In the case of hard coal, both domestic and imported, well, this is supplied to power plants, coating plants, the iron and steel sector, various other industrial users, and some again is also used for heating applications. Now let's turn our attention to the coal-fired power sector. The main lignite-fired fleet is made up of around 15 major stations. These are a combination of pulverised coal combustion and fluidised bed plants. In a typical year, between 25 and 30% of the country's electricity is generated by lignite and hard coal. Typically, lignite-fired plants would generate perhaps 17 to 18%, and those fired on indigenous and imported hard coal will produce another 11 to 12%. And these pictures show you just a couple of examples of lignite-fired plants. On the left is the Afsin Elbistan B plant. This is one of Turkey's bigger power stations, and on the right is the Kemakoy plant. Now, in the case of hard coal, there's only one major plant supplied by Turkish mines, but there are also 6 that rely on imports. There are also a lot of new projects at various stages in their development. Some will be fired on lignite and others on hard coal. And with the latter, there are at least 7 major projects ranging between 350 and 1300 megawatts being developed that plan to use supercritical steam conditions. There's also a growing number of fluidized bed combustion plants being developed, a technology that's already well established in Turkey. So, as we now know, Turkey has both hard coal and lignite, and the deposits of the latter are by far the biggest. As you can see, there are a number of organisations that are directly involved with the coal sector in some way. The main ones are, well, the top one, the state-owned TKI, or Turkish Coal Enterprises. This produces lignite for power plants and other users. There's the state-owned TTK, or Turkish Hard Coal Enterprise, responsible for hard coal supply, but not involved with lignite. There's the state-owned UAS, or Electricity Generating Company. This also mines lignite, but only for its own power plants. And there's also the Directorate of Mineral Research Exploration, which, as its name suggests, is responsible for exploration activities associated with both lignite and hard coal. And of course there's the private sector, active in both lignite and hard coal production. In the future, a growing proportion of the country's coal assets will be transferred to the private sector, a process that's already underway. So lignite is by far Turkey's most important energy resource, with deposits available in all geographical regions. In fact, it's present in more than 40 individual provinces. As exploration is continuing to take place, potentially lignite, well, and indeed hard coal, reserves could be much greater than current estimates suggest. At the moment, nearly 90% of lignite reserves are operated by public sector organisations, and this shows you the breakdown. Now, even though the quality can be poor or variable, it's an important energy resource, and significant amounts are mined each year. In a typical year, total lignite production is usually around 70 million tonnes, although it has been up to nearly 75. Now, as I mentioned, unlike lignite, hard coal deposits in commercial production is limited to a single region, namely the Zonguldak Basin in the northwest of the country. Here, Turkish Hard Coal Enterprise, or TTK, essentially owns all such reserves. TTK effectively has a monopoly on the production, processing and distribution of hard coal within Turkey. However, some of the company's coalfields are in the process of being privatised, and some of the ones so far transferred to the private sector are now being operated on a royalty basis. But TTK is still the country's main hard coal producer, as at the moment the private sector produces only around 8% of the total. However, this does mask the fact that about 35% of production reported by TTK is actually mined by private companies working under subcontract, so the private sector's influence is greater than it might at first appear. Now, unlike lignite, national production is quite modest. It's usually around 3 million tonnes a year, a number that falls far short of the amount needed, which is usually around 30 million tonnes, for power generation and industrial use. Consequently, like oil and gas, the rest has to be imported. But looking to the future, the ongoing restructuring and privatisation of the hard coal sector that's taking place is expected to boost production. And by 2023, various forecasts suggest it could be up around the 12 million tonne mark. So it still won't meet all demand, but potentially could make a sizable dent in it. Now, as hard coal production can't meet demand, around 90% of it is imported. In 2012, imported steam and coking coal was nearly 30 million tonnes, plus there was also 4 million tonnes of petcoke brought in. So this combined total often exceeds 30 million tonnes a year. In the near term, as some of the new coal-fired power plants come online and iron and steel production expands, imports are expected to increase by at least 2 to 2.5 million tonnes a year. At the moment, in a typical year, power plants fired on imported hard coal generate around 12% of Turkey's electricity, with those using domestic coal providing another 1 to 2%. At the end of last year, nearly 4 gigawatts of hard coal-fired generating capacity was being fired on imports. Plus, there were a further 2.3 gigawatts of new projects at various stages in their development. With the way things are developing in the foreseeable future, Turkey is expected to become one of the world's fastest growing coal importers. And this figure here, this picture, is just to give you an example of a major Turkish power plant that relies on imports. This is the 1.3 gigawatt Sugozu plant. It generates around 4% of Turkey's electricity and is based on a similar design to a number of high-efficiency power plants in Germany. Now, clearly, in order to access the supplies of imported coal, it's located on the Turkish coast. And this is how it gets its coal. The plant uses up to 30,000 tonnes a day, brought in using one of the world's largest floating coal trans-shipment terminals. This handles 3 million tonnes a year, with coal usually delivered by Cape-sized vessels, mainly from Colombia and South Africa. Cranes on the facility unload the coal from the ship onto a conveyor belt system which discharges it into what's called an HSU, or hopper self-unloading unit, which is moored between the twin hulls of the trans-shipment facility. Once an HSU is loaded, it's then pushed by tugs 2 miles to the jetty, where it's emptied using its own self-unloading system. A shoreside conveyor belt then transports the coal directly to the power plant. Using this, normally a Cape-side vessel would take around 4 days to empty. Now, the Turkish government is making serious efforts to reduce expensive and potentially unreliable energy imports and make greater use of indigenous resources. As part of this, 2012 was designated as Domestic Coal Year, and this was backed by government policy initiatives that gave increased priority to the use of domestic lignite for power generation. A coal strategy has since been adopted, and these are some of its main aims. In essence, they focus mainly on diversifying energy sources and supplies and the reduction of energy imports through the greater use of domestic resources. Over the next decade, a major aim is to reduce the country's share of electricity generated by gas-fired stations from the current level of around 40% to less than 30%. This is being given a further push by the ongoing privatisation of various Turkish coalfields and power assets. There's a goal of achieving an additional 18 gigawatts of coal-based installed generating capacity within the present decade, and an overarching goal of reaching somewhere between 100 and 120 gigawatts of capacity by 2023, nearly double that of today's total of 64. There appears to be quite a strong commitment at government level to the use of some of the cleaner and more effective coal-based systems for power generation, as well as the general support for applications of CCTs in various other ways, such as gasification. These measures appear to be having some effect, as applications for new gas-fired plants have fallen, with investors withdrawing or cancelling some proposed projects. And at the same time, applications for coal-fired plants have been increasing dramatically. So let's take a quick look at the makeup of the power sector, lignite and hard coal's biggest market. As we've heard, the expanding economy has created one of the fastest growing energy markets in the world, and electricity requirements have soared. And this graphic will give you some idea of how this has developed in recent years and how it's expected to carry on growing. At the moment, thermal and hydro plants provide the bulk of Turkey's electricity, and this was the situation in 2011 to 12. But as I've mentioned, the plan is to add nuclear power and more renewables to the mix, so that by 2023, the aim is that roughly 30% of Turkey's electricity will come from coal, 30% from hydro and other renewables, 30% from gas, plus now 10% from nuclear. So what efforts are being made to minimise environmental impacts associated with the production and use of coal within Turkey? Well, starting near the beginning of the production chain, we find the growing use of coal cleaning techniques, used mainly to reduce the levels of ash in both hard coal and lignite. A typical plant is shown here in the upper picture. This particular unit treats Zonguldak hard coal. Now, coal washing is clearly beneficial as it reduces ash content to more manageable levels, helps avoid the need to handle and transport unwanted inert materials, and also minimises problems when it's burnt at the power plant. There are a growing number of coal washers in use, with most of the bigger units having been brought online since 2004. TKI, or Turkish Coal Enterprises, and its contractors alone has a washing capacity of more than 24 million tonnes a year. At the moment, around 40 to 45% of the country's total lignite production is being washed, and new washing capacity continues to be added to the sector. Now, in the case of lignite, a surprisingly wide range of different products is available, each with a different specification tailored to a specific market need. As you can see here, the properties of the end product can differ quite a lot. Much depends on which particular market it's going to. Interestingly, new cleaning technology is also in the process of being introduced. some of it developed by Turkish companies. For instance, CWP of Izmir is installing an advanced washery based on what it calls its tri-GFC or three-product gravity feed cyclone separator technology for a coal directorate in Amasya, which is shown in the lower picture being built. This will be the first such application in Turkey, and once the plant's effectiveness has been confirmed, it's likely to be replicated at other sites. Now, over the course of the past 2 decades, many of Turkey's bigger coal-fired power stations have been equipped with some form of FGD, usually to control SO2 and other emissions. In fact, from 1986, FGD became mandatory on all new plants. Individual power plants now operate up to 4 FGD units, although most have 2 or 3. And the left-hand picture shows you one example of this. This is the recently privatised Lignite-fired Yatagan plant, which uses 3 wet limestone gypsum FGD units. Although most of the larger power plants now have some form of FGD, some of the older ones don't. However, most of these are expected to be suitably re-equipped and upgraded as they're sold into the private sector. The lack of equipment such as FGD is usually factored into the selling price. Now, when it comes to controlling particulates, all major plants use various types of ESP, and alongside this, several of the hard coal plants also deploy a combination of low NOx burners and SCR systems for controlling NOx emissions. All new plants in development or under construction will be equipped with comprehensive emission control systems to control SO2, NOx and particulates. And plants that lack suitable emission control systems have been given until 2019 to remedy the situation. Now, moving further down the production chain, what happens to the solid waste produced from electricity generation? Well, as you've heard, lignite-fired power plants produce a lot of the country's electricity, so large tonnages, often with a high ash content, are used, and consequently significant amounts of combustion residues such as fly ash and bottom ash are generated. Ash and slag plus gypsum from FGD units makes up most of the solid waste produced. Annually, Turkish power plants produce more than 20 million tonnes of such residues, but not all of this is dumped, and some fly ash is used for cement and concrete manufacture. In addition to this, nearly 1 million tonnes of gypsum is produced from FGD operations, and although a lot is landfilled, some is used for wallboard manufacture, for instance from the Sugozu plant that we saw earlier. Now, in 2012, US thermal power plants generated just over 1/5 of Turkey's electricity. However, the Turkish generation sector, formerly dominated by US, is being progressively opened up to the private sector. Significant progress has been made in this process, and in recent years, publicly owned generation has dropped from 78% to 46% of the country's total. As part of this, a number of coal-fired power plants have so far been privatised, and this is an example of one. This is the lignite-fired Soma plant, where in 2013 the operating rights were sold for $2.2 billion to a Turkish company. At the moment, the private sector owns and operates a bit more than half of Turkey's power generation assets, although the near-term aim is for this to be at least 85%. However, the government may decide to classify some plants as strategic assets and hang on to them. Now, we can't really talk about Turkey without some reference to the recent tragedy. As you'll all only be too aware, last month on the 13th of May, there was a serious fire and explosion at an underground lignite mine in Soma, in the Peninsula. This is an area that has a high concentration of lignite mines. As elsewhere, much of the lignite is produced here from large open cast mines, although there is, as here, clearly also some underground mining. The explosion here took place some 2 kilometres underground, and the resulting fire burned into the 15th of May. More than 300 miners were killed in what was the worst disaster in Turkey's mining history. Now, some Turkish hard coals and lignites have been shown to be quite gassy. They can contain quite high levels of methane. In the case of hard coal, some of these have an unfortunate tendency for spontaneous combustion, and this has caused a number of serious mine fires in the Zonguldak region. Spontaneous combustion was found to be responsible for at least some of these. And on occasions, high concentrations of methane have been responsible for mine fires and explosions. Now, for an explosion of this type to occur, important factors are often the levels of coal dust and or methane present. And although the precise cause of the explosion and fire at the Soma mine is still under investigation, it seems quite possible that methane may have played a part. Sadly, mining accidents have been fairly common in Turkey. The only hope from this disaster is that the lessons will be learned from this and used to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. Let's certainly hope so. And finally, before we leave Turkey, let's turn our attention to the area of clean coal technologies. We've already talked about some of these, but historically, the commercial scale deployment of CCTs has been mainly fluidized bed boilers, supercritical pulverized coal boilers, various environmental control technologies such as FGD and SCR units, and a number of coal cleaning systems. However, as the national focus has been shifting towards the greater use of indigenous lignite and hard coal, interest in the wider deployment of CCTs has increased. This has now reached governmental level, and the government is actively encouraging the development of cooperative R&D networks for power generation and the production of liquid fuels, hydrogen and chemicals, mainly through the gasification of Turkish lignite. And this will give you a glimpse of what's happening in each of these particular areas. There's no time to go into each in detail, but suffice it to say in each there's quite a lot of activity underway or planned. Now moving on to other areas of CCTs. Gasification. Well, lignites continue to be the focus of R&D activity for a number of organisations. This includes the state-owned TKI that for more than a decade has been carrying out research on a range of lignite-related topics such as gasification. And some of the more important recent developments are these. Perhaps one of the most interesting is the first one. With the aim of reducing national gas imports, TKI has set up a new pilot-scale in-train flow gasifier in the town of Kütahya. This became operational at the tail end of 2012 and is gasifying local lignite to produce SNG, or synthetic natural gas. Apart from its use to replace natural gas for power generation, it's also to be evaluated for the possible production of methanol, various chemicals, and liquid fuels. TKI is exploring the system's potential to eventually produce perhaps 1 to 1.5 billion cubic metres a year of SNG, and this would be sufficient to meet almost 10% of Turkey's natural gas requirements. Now moving on, IGCC. Well, clearly Turkey's got no commercial IGCC plants, although its lignites continue to be evaluated by various organisations with this eventual use in mind. Co-utilisation of coal and biomass. Well, as we heard earlier, interest in renewable energies is increasing in Turkey, and as a significant energy resource, biomass is being looked at for various co-combustion and co-gasification applications. Coal to liquids. The production of liquid products, such as transport fuels from coal, would clearly help reduce the country's sky-high dependency on imported oil, as well as enhance its energy security. In recent years, several projects have addressed this topic, and these are a couple of them. Underground coal gasification activities. Well, for some years, the UCG of both lignite and hard coal has been considered, although most studies have concentrated on lignite. Some Turkish lignites have been shown to gasify well and to be possible candidates for UCG. And as a result, TKI, or Turkish Coal Enterprises, has instigated a program aimed at developing commercial-scale products. And finally, carbon capture and storage-related activities. Turkey has been involved in a number of major European CCS initiatives, and there is some expertise on these technologies within a number of Turkish organisations. It seems likely that emphasis on this area will increase as greater volumes of lignite come to be used within the country. And so to close, the country has weathered the global economic storm much better than many others have, and its economy is doing very well. Electricity demand is rising rapidly and is expected to carry on increasing for the foreseeable future. But there are energy supply issues and a heavy reliance on expensive imports, particularly of gas and oil. To help counter this, a coal strategy is now in place aimed at using more indigenous energy resources, particularly lignite, to help minimise imports, but to also help bolster security of supply. The country has a lot of lignite. Although much of it is poor quality, it's widely available, can be produced cheaply, and more is still being found. Hence, it's of particular importance to the Turkish energy sector. Each year, the country imports up to 30 million tonnes of hard coal, a level that's expected to increase quickly. Much of this goes to the power sector, and this, and some coalfields, is in the process of being privatised, with assets moving increasingly to the private sector. In terms of clean coal technologies, well, Turkey already has some supercritical PCCC generating capacity, as well as a number of fluidized bed plants in operation. There are more of both in the pipeline. And in this respect, it's good to see cleaner, more advanced technologies being applied on a commercial basis, and the promise of quite a lot more to come. So even allowing for the fact that some targets could be best described as ambitious, and that some proposed power and mining projects may not go ahead, everything points to the coming period being a busy one for the coal-fired power sector and for Turkish coal industry in general. thank you for listening. That brings me to the end of my presentation. And we'll see if we have any questions you may have put in. That's an interesting one, the first one. What plans are there to reduce carbon emissions? At the moment, much of this is really fairly low on the agenda, it seems. Turkey has been involved with quite a number of overseas multi-partner projects through the EU, and so they are engaged in that side of things, but there are no sort of demonstration plants planned at the moment that I'm aware of. Much of what they are planning to do is focusing on the power sector in particular, where they're aiming to reduce CO2 emissions from coal-fired plants by generally increasing their performance and effectiveness. So there's a fairly extensive rehabilitation program in place, and obviously, as I've mentioned already, the plan that most of the new, or a lot of the new major power plants will be using more effective systems such as supercritical steam conditions, which obviously increases the efficiency and reduces the CO2 output per kilowatt. So I think that's where a lot of the focus is at the moment, although I suspect in the coming years, as the greater use of lignite does take off, that Turkey will become more engaged in this. From which countries do the coal imports come from? Is there a preference for Russian coal or coal from Eastern Europe? There doesn't seem to be. Coal comes from Russia, it comes from South America, it's coming from the USA, I believe some is coming from Canada. So they're pretty well situated geographically to pull in supplies from quite a few other parts of the world. So there doesn't seem to be a particular preference. I think it'll all come down to the price mainly. Are there any shale gas prospects? And has the existing gas supply been affected by the Russian-Ukraine crisis? As far as I'm aware, the existing gas supply is still sound and operating. I'm sure, as with other countries that rely on Russia, they're looking for alternatives, and there are a number of pipelines that are being built in the region that probably will be tied into at least some of the Turkish power generation system. Compared to lignite, hard coal production in Turkey is quite low. Is this expected to increase much in the future? Yeah, you're quite right at the moment. I think I mentioned hard coal production is quite low. It's only around 3 million tonnes a year, but of course demand is around 30. I think I mentioned there are fairly ambitious plans to increase this to around 12 million tonnes by 2023. Much of this is to be achieved through the restructuring and privatisation of the sector, a process that's already underway. If all goes according to the plans I've seen, production should increase steadily year on year, with most production coming from 3 large mining areas within the Zonguldak Basin. Production is expected to pick up particularly from 2018, when the third of these actually starts producing. However, not everyone thinks this level of production of 12 million tonnes will be achievable, and some industry observers regard this level as over-optimistic. I guess time will tell in that respect. We shall doubtless see. One more question here, I think. You mentioned that more supercritical power plants are going to be built. Will these be limited to those using imported hard coal? Well, at the moment there's only one operational plant, the Z2 plant, that uses supercritical conditions, although there are quite a few prospects in development or under construction who will also use supercritical steam. It's true that at the moment most of the supercritical projects are focused on hard coal, although it seems quite likely that at least some of the bigger capacity lignite ones might well do the same. At the moment it's a little difficult to be very clear about this. A lot of these projects are still at fairly early stages, so there's not a lot of information available on the precise nature of the technology being proposed. However, it does seem quite likely that some of the bigger projects might go this route. There are some projects that propose using both hard coal and lignite, and at least one of those is going to go for supercritical conditions. Again, I think the situation will become much clearer in the next year or so as more information becomes available in the public domain. Well, that seems to be the end of the questions. And I just close by saying my PowerPoint will be available from the webinar page of our website later on today. Next month's webinar will take place on Wednesday the 16th of July at midday UK time. In this, Dr. Leslie Sloss will present a research on blending of coal to meet power station requirements. If there are any other points you'd like to address or would like any further information on the work of the Clean Coal Centre or on my report, please feel free to visit our website or contact me via my email address shown at the end of my presentation. That brings me to the end of today's webinar. Thank you for your attention and goodbye.